The council chamber was big enough to hold a small city inside it. The walls curved upward like the inside of a shell, and the light came from panels that changed color depending on who was speaking. 14 civilizations had seats at the long curved table. Each seat was filled. Each face, or whatever passed for a face among the assembled beings, was turned toward the single human who had just walked through the door. His name was Leonard Cole. He was 53 years old, with gray at his temples and a way of walking that made it look like he had nowhere urgent to be. He carried a small bag over one shoulder and a data chip in his left hand. He wore a plain dark coat. No medals. No rank insignia. No weapons. He was alone. The being at the head of the table was called Vreth. He came from a civilization known as the Khaldun, and his people had been part of the Galactic Council for over 800 years. He had seen many species take their first steps into council politics. Most of them arrived nervous. Many of them arrived trying too hard. Big ships, loud speeches, long lists of achievements. Vreth had learned to measure a species by how they walked into a room. This human walked in like a man going to a quiet meeting he had already prepared for. Vreth found that unsettling, though he did not show it. The formal words were spoken. Leonard sat down. A council aide brought him a glass of water, which he accepted with a small nod. The session was called to order. Vreth explained that before humanity could be considered for a full seat at the council, a standard assessment of their military capacity would be conducted. This was routine. Every species went through it. It was meant to establish where they stood in the larger order of things. Leonard listened. He nodded once when Vreth finished speaking. Then Vreth asked the question directly. He asked Leonard to present Earth's registered warship manifest, a full accounting of all active military vessels. Leonard reached into his bag and took out the data chip. He leaned forward and set it on the table, sliding it gently toward the center reader. He did not say anything. He simply sat back and picked up his glass of water. Vreth picked up the chip and placed it into the council's central system. The display above the table flickered on. The file began to load. It took longer than expected. The loading bar moved slowly across the screen. One of the other council members, a thin creature from a water-breathing species, leaned forward to check if there was a system error. There was no error. The file was simply very large. When the manifest finally opened, the chamber went quiet. Not politely quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes before someone speaks. This was the kind of quiet that happens when a room full of beings all stop breathing at the same time because what they are looking at does not match what they were expecting. Vreth stared at the screen. He scrolled down. He kept scrolling. The list did not end where lists like this were supposed to end. Ships were logged by registry number, class, construction date, and current status. There were hundreds of entries. Then thousands. And some of the construction dates, Vreth had to look twice, went further back than anything he had been prepared to see. Further back than the founding of the council itself. Further back than the recorded history of half the civilizations sitting at the table. He looked up at Leonard. Leonard was looking out at the far wall, as if he found the architecture mildly interesting. He sipped his water. Vreth set the chip down very carefully and said nothing for a long moment. Around him, the other council members were whispering to each other in low, fast tones. Some of them were running their own calculations. One of them had gone entirely still. The chamber stayed silent. Leonard did not rush anyone. It did not happen all at once. Nothing about humanity ever did. In the year 2091, a radio telescope array in the high desert picked up a signal that did not come from any known natural source. It was not a message, exactly. It was more like a knock on a door, a structured pattern repeating at precise intervals, coming from somewhere deep in the galaxy. The scientists who found it spent 6 months confirming it before they told anyone. Then they told the government. Then the government told no one else for another 2 years. The debate that followed was long and serious. Some argued that humanity should respond immediately, loudly, with full confidence. Others argued for patience. In the end, patience won, not because it was the popular choice, but because a quiet man named Calvin Price stood up in a closed room and made a case that nobody was able to argue with. Calvin Price was the director of a small strategic planning office that most people had never heard of. He was not a soldier or a scientist. He was a planner. And what he said, in that closed room, was simple. The universe is very old, and we do not know what is in it. We have had less than 100 years of flight. Whatever sent that signal has had longer. We should not walk into that room thinking we are the strongest thing there. His full proposal was written into a classified document called the Long Silence. Its core idea was this: Earth would prepare, fully and seriously, for whatever contact might come, but it would not advertise that preparation. It would build. It would be ready. And it would let others assume, for as long as possible, that it was not. Construction began in 2099. The first yards were built inside the hollowed cores of 3 large asteroids in the belt between the 4th and 5th planets. They were cold, dark, and invisible to any sensor passing at a distance. Supply ships traveled without markings. Workers signed documents that their grandchildren would still be legally bound by. Each generation inherited the program and passed it on. Children grew up hearing nothing about it, then were brought in when they were old enough and trusted enough. Some of them spent their entire working lives inside yards that appeared on no map. Some of them never told their families what they actually did. The oldest ships, those built in the earliest phase of the program, were called the Iron Ancestors. Not officially. That was simply what the workers started calling them, quietly, among themselves. The first of these was completed in the year 2201 and given only a registry number. No ceremony. No naming. The crew that took it on its first test run filed a routine systems report and then went back to their quarters. In 2289, a young engineer named Danny Wu was assigned to maintenance work on one of the Iron Ancestor vessels. He had known about the program for 4 years by then, but standing inside the ship, feeling the size of it, the age of it, the quiet weight of what it represented, still stopped him for a moment. He ran his hand along the inside of the hull. The metal was old in a way that felt almost deliberate. He thought about the people who had welded those plates into place almost 100 years before he was born. He thought about how they had done that work knowing no one would ever thank them, knowing no one outside those walls would ever even know. He whispered something to the empty corridor. He said, quietly, that nobody knows you exist. That is the whole point. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. The long silence lasted nearly 300 years. Fleets grew in the dark. Officers were trained in facilities that did not appear in any budget that was available to the public. Entire generations of human beings chose to carry a secret that was larger than anything else in their lives, because they believed it was the right thing to carry. When Leonard Cole walked into the council chamber with that data chip, every single one of those people was in his pocket. He knew it. He did not say it. He simply sat and waited for the room to finish understanding what it was looking at. Vreth composed himself the way a person composes themselves when they need everyone in the room to believe they are not afraid. He straightened in his chair. He folded his hands on the table. He told Leonard Cole, in a measured tone, that the council required proof of the manifest's accuracy before any further discussion could take place. A list on a chip, however long, was not evidence of an actual fleet. He said this carefully, so it did not sound like desperation. He was not sure he succeeded. Leonard looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small communications device. He set it on the table in front of him, pressed a single key, and spoke 2 words. He said, "Grace, proceed." Nothing happened for about 4 seconds. Then the council's own sensor arrays began to light up. The display above the table, the same one that had shown the manifest, switched automatically to a live feed from the network of detection satellites surrounding the council's home system. The satellites existed to monitor for incoming traffic, threats, and unauthorized approach. They were among the most sensitive instruments the council operated. They had been running continuously for over 200 years without a single significant false reading. They began returning signals. 1. Then 3. Then more than a dozen. Then the numbers climbed past anything the system was calibrated to display cleanly, and a council technician somewhere in the building started making urgent sounds into her own communicator. The signals were not weapons lock. They were not threat signatures. They were identification beacons, the kind of vessel broadcasts when it wants to be seen. And they were coming from everywhere. From the dark side of the system's outermost moon. From behind the gas giant on the council's trailing edge. from positions in the empty black between transit lanes that should have been completely unoccupied. One by one, on the display above the table, shapes appeared. Enormous shapes. Cold shapes that had apparently been sitting perfectly still in the dark for weeks, running no heat signature, emitting nothing, drawing no power beyond the minimum needed to keep a crew alive. They had been there the whole time. A younger council member, a small, wide-eyed being named Selu from one of the amphibious civilizations, turned to Vreth and said, very quietly, that they were already here. That they were already everywhere. Vreth did not answer. He was still looking at the display. Leonard put his communications device back in his pocket. He explained, without any particular pride in his voice, that the ships nearest to the Council's home system were among the newer additions to the fleet. The older vessels, the Iron Ancestors, were positioned further out, where their mass displacement would cause less concern. He clarified that none of the ships had targeted anything. None of them were running weapon systems. They had simply powered up their beacons when asked. He said that humanity had not built its fleet for conquest. It had never fired these ships in war. It had built them because the universe is very old, and patience is the only strategy that scales across centuries. On the display above the table, a face appeared. It belonged to a woman in a naval uniform, calm, sharp-featured, with close-cut gray hair and the posture of someone who did not move unnecessarily. Her name was Admiral Grace Norton, and she was standing on the bridge of a vessel that the sensor display suggested was approximately the size of a large terrestrial city. She looked at the council chamber feed for a moment. Then she nodded once at Leonard. Leonard nodded back. Around the table, 14 civilizations sat very still and looked at the screen, and understood, each in their own way, that the meeting they had planned and the meeting they were now in were two completely different things. Nobody spoke for a long time. Leonard poured himself another glass of water. The council called a private session. Leonard was asked to wait outside in a side room with a bench and a narrow window that looked out at nothing, just the gray metal of the station's outer wall. He sat down and closed his eyes. Inside the main chamber, Vreth led the emergency session with the controlled urgency of someone who knew that panic was the most dangerous thing in the room. He went through it methodically. He laid out what they knew. He laid out what they did not know. He asked for assessments from the military liaison of each civilization, and one by one they gave answers that all pointed in the same direction. Humanity's fleet, if the manifest was accurate and the demonstration was representative, was larger and older than anything the Council had on record. Much larger. Considerably older. One of the military liaisons asked the obvious question. Why had humanity hidden this? What did they want? Nobody had an answer. Selu slipped out of the session quietly, which was easy to do because she was small and the debate had grown loud. She found the side room without much trouble. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the human sitting on the bench with his eyes closed. She asked him if she could ask him something. Leonard opened his eyes and said yes. She sat down on the far end of the bench and folded her hands in her lap. She was younger than most council members, younger than Vreth by several centuries, in the way her species counted age. She had a way of looking at things very directly, without the formal distance that most senior council members maintained. She asked him, "Why show us now? You could have kept hiding forever." Leonard thought about that for a moment before he answered. He said that humanity had watched the Council struggle with 3 serious border conflicts in the last 12 years. He said that in each of those conflicts, lives were lost that did not need to be lost, because no single party had enough power to simply step between the sides and say, "This ends here." He said that Earth had reached the point where staying silent felt less like patience and more like a choice to let suffering continue when they had the means to stop it. Selu listened. She was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she said that made sense to her, even if it would not make sense to Vreth for some time yet. Leonard almost smiled. Aboard Hull 1, the first Iron Ancestor vessel, the oldest warship Earth had ever built, Captain Nora Vale was doing what she always did before a formal inspection, walking the ship alone. She did not do it to check on things. Her crew kept the ship in order without being told to. She did it because Hull 1 deserved it. Because someone should walk its corridors the way you walk through a place you respect. She moved slowly through the lower decks, where the original hull plating was still visible under 2 centuries of maintenance and repair. The ship was old in every sense of the word. It creaked sometimes, not from damage but from the slow settling that old things do. It had been refitted many times. Almost nothing of the original mechanical systems remained. But the bones were the same bones. She stopped at a panel near the ship's central core. It was about 2 meters wide and nearly as tall, and every centimeter of it was covered in small engraved text. Names. Thousands and thousands of names. Every crew member who had ever served aboard Hull 1, going back to the original team who had taken it out in 2201 for its first test run. Nora had stood in front of this panel many times over her 12 years as captain. She knew where her own name would eventually go, near the end, somewhere near the bottom right, in the next section that had not been filled in yet. She placed her hand on the panel and let it rest there for a moment. Then she heard her second officer's voice in her earpiece, letting her know the inspection team was ready to board. She took her hand down and straightened her coat. She had work to do. The council reconvened in full session 3 hours later. The debate had run long, and some of that showed in the way the members settled back into their seats, the careful, composed exhaustion of people who had argued hard and reached something they could live with, even if they were not sure they liked it. Vreth spoke for the council. He said they had reviewed the manifest, the sensor data, and the demonstration. He said the council did not dispute what had been shown. He said, with measured words, that humanity's position was now understood. Then he asked one final question. He said, if you had been threatened, truly threatened, with no other option, would you have used them? The chamber went very quiet. Leonard looked at Vreth for a long moment. Not calculating. Not weighing. Just looking at him the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that what you are about to say is the plain truth and nothing else. He said, yes. Vreth held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly. He said that was the first fully honest answer any human had given the Galactic Council in 40 years of diplomatic contact. He said the Council would vote. The vote was not unanimous. 3 civilizations abstained and 2 voted against. But the majority held, and humanity's proposed role, quiet guarantor, outside the political structure of the Council, bound by no vote and seeking no territory, was accepted on a provisional basis. Leonard thanked the Council. He stood, picked up his bag, retrieved the data chip from the reader, and walked out. In the corridor outside, Admiral Grace Norton's holographic image walked beside him, projected from the small device he carried. She moved in step with him, which always struck people who saw it as slightly unsettling, a full-size person made of light, keeping pace down a hallway. She asked if he thought it would hold. He said that most of the council was still frightened. He said frightened people make better neighbors than confident ones, because they think before they move. She almost smiled. Then her image faded as she cut the link, and Leonard walked the rest of the corridor alone. That evening, the Iron Ancestor fleet powered back down. The beacons went dark. The ships settled back into their long, cold drift in the spaces no one else used. To any sensor passing through, they would appear as nothing at all, just empty dark, just the quiet between stars. The same as always. 10 years passed. Selu came aboard Hull 1 on a clear morning, or what counted as morning by the ship's internal clock. She had requested the visit formally, through the new diplomatic channel that now existed between the Council and Earth's outer office. Captain Nora Vale had approved it without hesitation and had met her personally at the docking port. They walked together through the lower corridors. Selu asked about the ship's history, the real history, the kind that was not in any public record. Nora answered carefully and honestly, the way she answered most things. They stopped at the panel of names. Selu stood in front of it for a long time. She read names she could not pronounce. She counted sections. She did the quiet mental arithmetic of trying to understand what 4 million people choosing silence for 300 years actually means, what it costs, and who pays it, and why. She asked Nora how many people had kept the secret over all that time. Nora said she had stopped counting somewhere around 4 million. She said the actual number was probably higher. Selu did not say anything for a while. She reached out and touched one of the names near the middle of the panel, a name from the early 2200s, a name that had been engraved there for nearly 2 centuries. She could not read it. She did not need to. She just stood there with her hand on the metal, in the old quiet of the old ship, trying to understand the kind of people who could build something this large and then choose, for hundreds of years, not to tell anyone. Outside the hull, in the dark between stars, Hull 1 drifted on the way it always had, steady, patient, and completely silent, exactly the way the people who built it had always intended.